Hello, everyone. This is Liam from the Ælfric Homily Project, and today we're actually going to have our very first supplementary lecture. So this is going to go along with the recitation for Ælfric's preface, specifically his preface for his first series of homilies, which was published on the 15th of December, 2024. It's an 11-minute video. It's just me reading the Old English. There is my translation in the modern English next to this, the Old English text on the screen at least. If you wanted to use that text, you can go to the community tab here on YouTube, find my first post, my only post as of recording this, and copy it as needed. And but this is kind of one of the big reasons. The other part of why I wanted to do this channel is to look more in depth into the text, right? Kind of like how in a class, you might be told, okay, translate this text for class. This is maybe what your instructor, your preceptor, your professor would then talk about after you had done that. So I realize that I don't have anyone here participating in class. I don't know who's going to be watching this anyways, but hopefully this is useful. This is just the things that I realized that stood out to me when I went through the translation process. So let's get right into it. Again, this is mostly looking at the philology of the stuff. I'm currently a student to learning philology, and it is a good discipline, good old discipline. So, anyways, one thing that stood out to me, and that's why it's titled here or subtitled here, that it is a gospel with few borrowings. It's very, very well. Even though this is just a preface, so it's going to get some more secular stuff than you normally do in a homily. It's not quite a homily itself, right? That the message itself is very scriptural itself, right? And Ælfric has a good way with words, particularly with his translation. I think works really well. But if you look at it, especially compared to, especially if you look at the translation, actually, if you look at the language of it, there are very few borrowings in the language Ælfric uses, actually. So let's look at that. The borrowings that I might have missed some, but I think these are the only ones, actually. So we have disciple, not disciple, as it would be. SC is normally a sh sound in Old English, but since this is from Latin, discipulus, it doesn't have that, of course. So that is, of course, a disciple, like a student or a follower. We also have antichrist, which comes from the Greek antichristos, and that's pretty straightforward, I feel like. We also have martyrdom, which of course comes from Greek martus. I believe this is the early version martus, in R later. And we also have deovol, which is actually an early borrowing. This one, if you look at it, it looks a bit more what you'd think Old English looked like if you have any familiarity with Old English. And that's one actually comes from Proto-West-Germanic, duvol, from Latin diabolus, right? So dublus. It's an early borrowing. You can see Christianity having this influence on the language, even though, even before, in some sense, conversion, which makes it, or large-scale conversion, I would say. One thing I think that is interesting to note, though, is that there's early on in the preface, he says the word bene, which looks like bene, like maybe benediction. That is not borrowed from Latin. Ben is just another word for prayer, pretty much. So that one I think could confuse people, but it's not a borrowing. That's it, pretty much. So then first, we're going to get into his patrons here. I titled this Athelmar the Stout, or the Fat. That's what he's known in history as. He is a thane and elderman and patron of Ælfric, along with his father. Once his father passes away, it's this guy, Athelmar. But his father himself is actually Athelward. And he's known today to us actually as a historian. He's an early historian. He translated a copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that actually a copy that doesn't survive in Old English, which was written in Old English. This is translated into Latin. This is known as the Chronicon, actually. It is written in a humanetic style, excuse me, the preferred style of the 10th century English scholars, which uses an unusual vocabulary with words often derived from Greek. Um, that was all the rage, I guess. That was in vogue at the time. But William Malmesbury would actually criticize Althaward's and well, in this style in particular, only in the 12th century, so not much later, right? I mean, like it says of Elward, which is Althaward, a noble and illustrious character who attempted to arrange these chronicles in Latin, whose intention I could applaud if his language did not disgust me. It would be better to be silent. So pretty biting words, and of course from probably the most famous historian of the 12th century here, English historian. But Altamar actually would found Carnal Abbey and Ansham, which this is where Ælfric spent most of his time, after being trained in Winchester. So Saran Abbas, of course, is Carnal Abbey, and Ensham is what he was actually the first bishop of. I believe Athelmar actually refounded Saran Abbas. I'm not sure exactly when that was closed, but it was more of a when it got established again. He was the guy who patronized it. They're actually both descended from Athelred the First, which is actually the brother of Alfred the Great. The older brother, right? Alfred is the fifth son. Athelred is the fourth, right? So there's a relation there. There's royalty. They're royalty in a sense, actually, even so, not just nobles. All right. So the first thing we're going to get at. Here's the line from the preface. So these are I just wanted to look at common words for grace. Okay. I trust through God's grace. That's what this is, pretty much. Hild means it could mean grace, favor, protection. By the way, when you hear me reading, I'm just going to say hild, just I for this Y, or ild, or E, depending on what it is. And the Y is in Old English actually is not quite the same sound as an I. The Y is just a rounded I. So if you have like a E, that's the Y. E. Now that actually falls out in late Old English, and Ælfric is late Old English. So I don't round my lips when I say these Ys, by the way. We have est, which is consent, grace, kindness, pleasure, favor. Again, it's just another word for grace here. We have ad medu, which is normally translated as something like humility, but is sometimes used for grace as well. We also have ar, which is honor, grace, kindness, mercy, glory. You'll see these throughout. The thing I think is interesting here, though, is that it's not any of these, actually. It's a gift, Yiva, which it makes sense. It's through God's gift, right? It's easy to understand, I think. It actually, just note, it doesn't have the Norse influence of the velar G. It's not Giva. That would happen later, that influence. It is the palatal G. It's Eva. It just makes a Y sound. Also, another note here, true, which is Stua, which then is related to trust, of course, which is Truian, has no sense at this period of factual or like accurate, right? In a correct sense. But it has the idea of faithful, loyal, like the archaic plighting of troth, or this idea of a true friend. It definitely comes from this idea of unmoving, right? That's it. So it works. It is a natural progression to get us to where what true means now, or the truth is. And it is related to the word tree, actually, if I'm remembering correctly. So it just means loyal, though, pretty much. So anyways, that is that first part. So let's move on then. It says, Quath to his learning knichtem, okay, which is quoth to his learning knights, literally. If I were to translate this literally, right, which I didn't. Part of my translation I want to keep a lot of the syntax intact if I can, which will come off a little archaic. But as far as translating the words, I want to keep them close if I can, right? I will see later some words which are often translated in a more style you'd read in like a gospel commentary today or whatever. I want to keep the sense, but it'll often have today's language in it. This one does not. Obviously, I didn't put quoth to his learning knights. This is more accurately translated as disciples, as learning knights. Okay. In Old English, the word knight itself is not quite what we are normally, what you tend to think of, right? I have The Knight over here, actually, by Gene Wolfe, which is a great book, and this will come up with some of the meaning here in a second. It can mean boy, right? In Gene Wolfe's The Knight, the boy is a knight, and he just pretty much proclaims himself a knight, right? Very much falls on this Old English sense of knight. It can also mean a male servant or attendant, and it is also a male of a high military rank below a baron and having previously been a page or squire. However, this last is attested really late. It's from 1100, which is generally regarded as Middle English. Normally, you'll get Old English ending right at 1100 or so, maybe 1150, maybe 1066, I think, which is really particular. Language change doesn't just happen like that, right? I mean, like I mentioned earlier, the late Old English stuff sounds different than the early Old English stuff. And depending on your dialect too, right? Where this is West Saxon stuff, Ælfric is in the West Saxon dialect. A lot of the words that, if they do survive into modern English, are coming from an East Anglian dialect. So, anyways, this last definition is really kind of iffy, whether you would actually ever see this in an Old English text. A lot of the texts that you're going to see like this, they're just most likely actually going to be Middle English text. So, knight doesn't really mean this knight in shining armor figure that we imagine it does. In an Old English sense, Knichtem, again, you'd pronounce the k and the h as a h sound. And then this is knights, of course. The is the dative plural. Of course, modern German Knecht retains these meanings, pretty much all of them. Okay, so which are verb or our noun, knight doesn't really retain this idea of boy or servant or attendant. And then next, Old English, there is no future in it. That's a joke I've heard several times now. I mostly heard it from Professor Drought, but just something that came to mind very early on into this preface. So this shows up first as beoth, this idea of the future tense in Old English, right? Which is actually the present plural indicative of beon, to be. So beon is a verb meaning to be, okay? Wesan is also a verb meaning to be. Wesan is the normal verb meaning to be. Okay, beon indicates two things in particular. Okay, it is a gnomic present, which is just general truths, excluding things, about the South, right? You would say ich eum man, because I am a person, right? That is generally true, right? That's not going to change, right? But you'd still use wesan in this case. Eum is a conjugation of wesan, but the example of this would be winter bith childest. Winter is coldest, right? From Maxims 2. It's just a general truth. So beon is used here. There's also the future tense. That's normally what beon is going to represent here. And in the preface, you actually see it quite a bit. So if it represents the future tense without needing the morphology. It represents the future tense with morphology rather than the context clues. Excuse me. So, like something like this, right? This is pretty much saying the same thing, right? Ich eom se king, right? I am the king, versus ich beo se king, which means I will be the king. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that difference there. Just know that beo does mean to be, but it generally has these things that you need to know about it, right? It's a gnomic present, and it represents the future tense. There are more interesting features about beon I really don't need to get into right now, but this covers the general usage, especially with this preface here. So we also have another sentence, though, here. We have, and ak swirchatha ye koronan men. One thing I just think is interesting, right? Because this means, and also the chosen people. This also, Koranan, could have been chosen. It could be elect. If you want to use some modern terminology, elect would probably be a good replacement there. But this is a cha often, right? When this chosen, it is related to the word chosen, right? This cha before e or I, as you can see over here on the table, or it's just the ka sound before u or o. This is the e are front high vowels. that's where you get this palatalization of the cuss sound. A lot of these are hard to see in not a lot, and some of these are hard to see in Old English. Just like the word, for example, chin is cinn or whatever, right? Chin. You would need to know the etymology that it's a cha in this case, as opposed to kin, which is pretty. You could spell it the exact same way if you wanted, but kin comes from a ku in Proto-Germanic, and the u, when that sound change happened, would have prevented that ka from becoming a cha. Well, chin itself still had that high front vowel, and it had that palatalization to cha. Anyways, but you can see here on this table, I took this from Wiktionary, cheoza and chas, chiest, as opposed to kure and kuron, and down here, ye kuron, as we have here in actually the example. Also, men here at the end, it means man, really, is the normal version of it. This means person. It doesn't really mean a guy, I guess you want to put it that way. It means mankind as well. I'm sure you can recognize this, but say like the book Ashes of Man by Christopher Rocchio, right? It's not ashes of random guys, right? It's just ashes of mankind, right? Humanity, pretty much. It's not. There's nothing really. There's not like this general idea that it's sexist or whatever. Man just means person. Okay. It can rarely mean adult male. Okay, and just is. This is where obviously it would go because man normally just means a guy now. So English still had grammatical gender at the time, and it was a masculine noun. Words for man with our modern meaning, though, so what you would see and you would translate as man, meaning a guy, okay, would be were, okay, like in werewolf, guma, which is actually cognate with homo, as in Homo sapiens, beorn, haleth, sedge, rinch or rink, I think it's rink actually, and then madge. Sedge is interesting because there's actually a word for sword that looks very, very similar, or sedge in the nominative at least. So anyways, there's lots of words for man or warrior. I think were and guma would maybe be the more popular ones. The other ones you'd more likely see in poetry. So depending on what you're reading, I guess. But you'll see men just means person or people, depending on what it is, inflection, quite often. And then we have allmännisch förwärde, all will perish. Okay, so förwärtan, this is mostly just a interesting bit, real quick. It means to perish, right? Obviously, from for, which is a prefix that really means wrongly or destruction or perversion or stray. It means a bunch of things. Often it means it's the bad, it's the extra bad version of something. Excuse me. So werthan means to happen or become. So it happened badly, right? So, right, in a sense. So that hence perish. Excuse me. So in modern English, actually, which is really as far as dialects goes in Scotland and Northern England, we have the version of forworth, which means to perish, forfare, come not or ruin, something can go wrong, right? That's just a modern English. That's one thing I like about reading these Old English texts is that you'll, if you didn't know them already, you'll discover a modern English equivalent. Almost always they're dialectal or they're obsolete or archaic or something, right? But you'll find these things pretty often. We also, we have Fella Jedreched Nisa and Arf Foth Nisa. So many afflictions or tribulations and hardships is what it literally is. I translated actually as much affliction and hardship. I put it in the singular. It seemed to work. I mean, as far as like semantics are concerned, I didn't think it really mattered. That's just mostly a point I wanted to point out. If someone went and saw the Old English and like, hey, he put this as singular when it's obviously plural here, I try to retain as much of it as I can. If it's in the plural, I often want it to be in the plural in the modern English translation. If it's in singular, I often want it to be. Not completely. You'll see that often with something like Helvenum, right, which means the heavens, right, often. But you almost always see it translated as heaven. And most other translations, I try to retain the heavens often. So this, again, right, and this, I didn't even remember I added this to the slide. So again, semantically, it seemed the same. It didn't seem to matter really. I just point that out. Next, we have one that I think is really fun. Ur Highland is sothliche man an god und anam hada. I'm actually going to look at a couple things in this excerpt. Highland, maybe Highland. But our Savior is truly a man and God in one person. That's a good way to translate it. So one, I think this is an interesting thing because it kind of talks about this idea of condescension of God coming down into the form of man. Highland itself, though, is the thing I find most interesting in here. It means Jesus. Often, if you look it up in a dictionary, it's going to be like, yeah, maybe it just is going to suggest Jesus, especially if it has the capital H, which in the manuscript it wouldn't, right? With context, you can know what we would today capitalize. But it's actually translated as savior or healer. You can put this actually in lowercase, and it can just mean healer. In fact, I think there is a modern English equivalent. It's like Helen or something like that. But it is actually cognate to the Old Saxon Heliond, which the Helion, again, capital H, is actually an epic alliterative, a 9th century poem. We have a copy of, here's a manuscript of it, actually, over here on the right, the manuscript in the folio source down below. But Helion, Old Saxon is a really similar language to Old English. So if you have the Germanic languages, you have the East Branch, which has like Lombardic, Burgundian, Vandalic, and Gothic is really the one we have like a good amount of, but they're all extinct. Nothing survives. North Germanic, which then you have the Scandinavian languages, all coming pretty much from Old Norse. And then you have West Germanic, which would be then Dutch, the German languages, and then as well as English. And English itself is part of the North Sea Germanic group in West Germanic, and those include Old Saxon, which doesn't really survive today, but it is somewhat similar to Low German as far as I can tell. I've not studied much Old Saxon or any version of German much myself, but then the two closer ones, even closer than Old Saxon, would be Old Frisian and Old English. Old Frisian and Old English are often even grouped together in their own subgroup called Anglo-Frisian. And they are pretty similar. There's a lot of sound changes that Old Frisian and Old English will share. And in fact, some that they'll share that Old Saxon won't. For example, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the word church has two palatalized c's to begin cercha. So I have that in Old English. It's cerkia, I think, in Old Frisian. I have to look this up. It's been a minute since I studied Old Frisian. And in Old Saxon, though, it's kirka. So it's retained both the cuz in Old Saxon. One of them is changed in Old Frisian, and both changed in Old English. But anyways, you kind of see a relation there. But yeah, Helion, it's kind of pretty much the old, I think it's called the Saxon Gospels often. It is a retelling of the Gospels, but from a very kind of Germanic warrior kind of perspective. Interesting in that sense. But here also I wanted to point out Hada, the very end here, Hada, which means person, just means person. Even I would say potentially a person of the Trinity, as that's what it's talking about. But earlier in the first sentence of the poem, actually, it means office or rank or order, whatever. Swafach wachrethones wircham hadam yebira. So just want to point that out. Had actually has a lot of meanings. So, and you can kind of see that they're not super close in meaning. I mean, they are. It's the same word. But anyways. And then we also have soth. Soth licha. I remember we were talking about true and trust not that long ago. Soth is truth in Old English, right? It means true or real as an adjective. Is soothe in modern English, sooth in modern English. It is related to soothe, though. And for soothly is a one way to say amen, pretty much in Old English, sothlicha. And it means pretty much the same thing. Anyway, so this actually comes from Proto-Germanic santhas, which has this West Germanic, West Germanic loses the nasals before spirants here. hence why the North Germanic has Sonner, has that nasal still. That doesn't have a fricative actually, or the spirit. But you actually see this in like the words like us, be uns, or something like that in other Germanic languages, or even tooth is tanth, which you can easily see the relation to something like denture or whatever. So you'll lose those ends at some period shortly before we would get Old English, I believe. Anyways, the next one we have Wille Nadian Manking to his Yedwirde. Will companion mankind to his deception. So Yedwild is just a good word to know, again, because it's really, we're not using borrowing so much here, but it means wandering, error, mistakenness, deception, heresy. It's just a general sense of the word. We also have this Greek idea of heresy, right, which means a choice, right, a deliberate and erroneous decision to deviate, essentially, right? English itself, the word heresy is a translation of the Latin heresis, but also error, which is wandering. So error is a word. Error is a Latin word, which means wandering itself. So I mean, we see error appear in the description for Yegul, but it means wandering, which is why wandering is before. Okay, then we have Theorlich Christ. So this is actually in the thumbnail for the reading of the preface itself. This Hildegard, sorry, von Bingen. This depicts the end of times, and here down on the bottom panel is the Antichrist. So we have Thwerch, which is a normal way of spelling it. This is like Thwerchli, right, essentially. So this is an explanation that Ælfric puts in, very short, to the listener that may not recognize the Latin anti or ante, in this case is antichrist, but itself ante, anti in modern English, anti, because we use it too, comes from Greek actually, but is related to Latin ante, which means before, prior, in front of, right? So like antebellum, right? They are related. They don't mean quite the same thing. In this case, it's against Christ. That's what antichrist means, or the antichrist nowadays, against Christ. So Thwer has pretty much that same meaning, right? It can mean cross, it can mean transverse, oppose, adverse, crooked, bent, right? So he's saying, he's gonna be like, oh, maybe you don't know what ante means here. Obviously you recognize Christ, which itself would come from Greek. But yeah, anyway, so there's a little explanation there by Ælfric, which I appreciate. But anyways, unthare svartan hella, in the dark hell. That's how I translated this. If you'll notice, though, it is literally in the swart hell. So swart, you could translate it swart, I guess. Dark, gloomy. This is typically meaning black when they say it in Old English, which is a meaning for it these days, obviously. I guess when you say swart, they're talking about black. So I can't remember how these are translated exactly. I think it's dark. I don't remember exactly how it is translated by Thorpe or Liuza when looking at other versions of other translations. But also we have hell, which is a word and concept that we are very used to, I feel like, as modern English speakers. It comes from Proto-Germanic halio, which means just underworld or netherworld. Doesn't have this idea of Christian hell. So English will often use vernacular words, see Easter pretty much, or applies borrowings to unique Anglicisms, as in Christmas, not being a calque of Nativitas Domini. In this case, actually, though, the other Germanic languages actually have cognates to hell that they all retain, which is interesting. Well, as opposed to say something like Easter, which is pretty much something related to Pascha and all the other Germanic languages. So, but yeah, rather than being taken from Hades from Greek or something like that, or Infernus from Latin, we have hell. Right? Again, familiar concept to an English speaker. It's interesting, I think, that they decided to retain that rather than translate it. And sometimes you'll see them. Maybe they use Infernus sometimes, right? Or Inferno. We obviously have Inferno now, but that normally just means fire, not hell so much specifically. But if you read some of the Hexateuch, actually by Ælfric, he'll have right next to each other, you'll have paradisum, which obviously is from the Latin paradise, but you also have neoxena wanga or something like that. Yeah, which is like this native word, which is really actually hard to to parse as far as etymologically. But it also means paradise of something of some sort. So, but he'll use them side by side in that case. Anyways, we also have Dir Licha Thur Deoflis Kraft. And this one, we got a couple words here again. So, secretly through the devil's craft is a good way to translate this, I think. Dir Licha, Dihoch Licha, Dachol Licha, which is secretly, comes from Dachol, which means secret, hidden, obscure, or dark. Now, you might recognize this guy from the Lord of the Rings down here. He's a secretive fellow. That's why he's got his name Dachol. I guess you'd say Deagle if you wanted to. So that's Smacholo also. They are Old English words. So it's just a little. Tolkien does that a lot. Anyways, this is from Peter Jackson's adaptation, of course. We also have Kraft, which means strength or power. I think those would be easy translations. I think power is maybe what both Leoza and Thorpe use. But it also means something like skill, art, virtue, profession, deceit, fraud, device, and particularly device in a magical sense. I use device, of course. I just think that power seems like such a lame translation for it, but it means so many things, just like Hod, means a lot of things. And I think that the devil, I view him as a crafty figure, right? He's a tricky fellow, right? So device seemed right. Though I do think craftiness also would work, right? The devil's craftiness. So just stuff like that. And that would also retain this. Obviously, craftiness is related to craft. So while the other ones are not descended from craft. Anyways, from Heora Shipendus Lavan. Yeah. Hey, from the belief of their shaper. Some from their shaper's belief. Literally, is the apostrophe S thing over there. I kind of intertwine. I'll be sometimes of blank or shape or like es in the thing. But anyways, so ich lava. So the ea is one thing. Actually, I don't know if you noticed. I take a moment to share this real quick. When I am reading this is one of the hardest sayings I'm still trying to get down as far as Old English pronunciation goes. The ea is generally considered to be an a that drops into an ah. So so rather than ea or anything like that. So ichlava. And again, this prefix a ye should not be stressed. It should be followed in lava, right? So lava. So the stress and that ea sound. Those are the things I think I find the hardest so far. But that's part of this, right? I want this to be a good source, but I also am practicing pretty much. So ichlava can actually mean a few things because it can mean faith or belief or even religion. I think it's almost always when I've looked at Leoza and Thorpe, it's almost always faith. I think it often works as faith and makes most sense as faith, but not always. I think belief, I maybe right here I use belief from the belief of their shaper because I think it works. But anyways, I wanted to point out though another thing that we've noticed Shipendes is capitalized here. So we have these verbs ye shipan versus ye werkan. So shipan. This is a similar thing that we saw earlier, where it's two words that kind of mean the same, like bayon and wesan, but they don't, right? There's different uses. So shipan is the loftier verb, meaning to create, to make, mold, right? It's almost completely attested, describing deities, right? You'll even see it in Cadman's hymn, Cadman's hymn is vague. It seems like it could be talking about a Christian god, but potentially maybe another type of god, like a Germanic god. Though it does actually have a wider sense, right? It's almost always this, right? I mean, we have this example here, men namen yeshrepan, to give someone a name, right? Which is not, in a sense, necessarily something a deity is doing. But in modern English, this is shape, shepan, shape. Okay. So I use this though over something like creator or maker, and definitely over worker. I think creator is probably the most often way of translating this. I think shaper still works. I think it still gets the meaning across, right? So from belief of their shaper, especially if you capitalize it. I think the meaning is going to get across just fine. And I think, again, that retains some of that old Englishism, if you would. Then we have to his Lassingum, for lease. Yeah. So, anyways, Lassung is where the modern English leasing comes from. So this is, I think this is best translated, actually. It's not left alone. So this means falsehood or trickery, or deception or lying, etc. These are all good translations, I feel like, in this context. It can also mean compensation, which in this understanding, it's kind of a negative compensation, obviously, right? It's just trickery, something bad compensation. So I think to his trickery is what I put in my translation. Thorpe uses to his leasings. Okay, this makes no sense to me as an English speaker, which is one of the things why this needed update. And I guess Leoza did it himself, and I did it not caring if Leoza just came out with these in October 2024, which is very nice, though. Congratulations, Leoza. I'm just saying I was going to do this regardless. Like if someone were to say, "Oh yeah, to his leasings," I don't get it. Okay, right? Like there is an archaic sense of leasings, which means lies and falsehoods, of course, and that's obviously what Thorpe means. But Thorpe was also writing in 1844, where I guess maybe that would be more understood by a reader. I don't know that. I don't see it though. I'm sure that's potentially how Thorpe saw it. But again, this kind of comes back into the learning nights thing. Like I want to get the point across. Okay. So to the leasings doesn't help me. I like knowing that there is this archaic leasings English word that means lies and falsehood, but I'm not going to use it in the translation here. If it was poetry, maybe, but for homily, no. Sa'an michtia god yethafath tham ar lasan antichrista. So the Almighty God suffers the glorious Antichrist. That's a way to put it. You could put graceless, I guess. Our lasan here, the same word as on the previous slide, of course. This is R suffix by las. So honor, glory, grace. Remember, R was one of those words that could be grace. This is the same. This las, though, is actually the same as the modern suffix less, right? So again, graceless, right? Gloryless. I wanted to retain that, right? I don't think Thorpe really use it that way, though. So Teif Borthan Halavan Yada. So we have another Old English thing we're kind of going to go over here. So for 3.5 years is how you translate this. But if you look at it, numbers are pretty difficult to change. They don't change all that much as far as language is concerned because you use them a lot. If you notice, this does not look like 3 in here. There doesn't look like, in fact, it looks like 4. It's 4th, really. So counting halves in Old English. The little math lesson real quick. So this is expressed with the ordinal of the next highest plus the word high. Ordinals are, first, second, third, fourth Indians, right? As opposed to the cardinals 1, 2, 3, 4. So other half is 1.5, right? Other half, literally second half in this case, right? Tredje half is 2.5, right? But literally third half. Third half is 2.5. Okay. We also have achta and 20 half, which is 27.5, right? To give you just an example of a somewhat bigger number. That's also how old I am, which I put it in here. Anyways, so I continued though. So the noun the half enumerates actually must be singular. So it was harfan yara, not harfum yarum, okay, which would be the plural. The exception is actually when another number is described. So we have the example of 3.5,000 chlafas, 2,500 loaves. Here, loaves still has to be plural because 2.5 describes the number of thousands rather than the loaves. Okay. So if the phrase was just 2.5 loaves, the noun would indeed be singular. 3.5 chlaf, rather. Sorry. All right. Math over. I'm not a big fan of math. But anyways, from achlem sinum thur tha ormatan echtmisa. So ormata is or suffix of prefix of or, which is without, and mata, which is average, moderate, mean. So this pretty much then means huge, excessive, boundless, yada yada yada. Right. So I translated it as from all sins by intense persecutions. which is funny. Is not even one of the things I meant, but intense is a good translation of it too. Lioza and Thorpe put great. I think putting great for so many verbs or so many words is just lame. So, anyways, I mean, yeah, I get it, but intense persecutions gets the point across just as much as great does. Anyways, ne akse warreoa antichrist naft. Nor also the cruel Antichrist has not. So warreo is cruel, bloodthirsty. Also, I don't know if you've noticed. I don't know if I go over it in this slide, so I'll mention it real quick. Naft is have not with the negative in just thrown on the front of it. You'll see this sometimes, often with pretty common verbs like that. Instead of putting the not on the end, like cannot, can't. You know what I mean? You'd actually put it at the beginning. Okay. Anyways, so Wachreo is cruel, bloodthirsty, barbarous. Literally, though, it is slaughter-rue, if you wanted that cognate in modern English, but sorrow is probably a good way of translating it there. Slaughter sorrow, right? But doesn't make a ton of sense. Nor also the slaughter sorrow Antichrist has not. That'd be a little confusing, I think, but it is what it is, literally. So this first element, though, is actually the same that is in Valkyria, which is the same Norse word as where we get Valkyrie. Just thought that was interesting. Anyways, Uradrichten bebad his disciple. So about time I focus on this one. We're going to focus on the second word here. Anyways, so Drichten, simply put, it means Lord. Okay, it is generally used in poetry, actually, but in prose, in poetry, it's going to mean whatever. But in prose, it's a capital D, Lord, God, right? The normal word in prose, though, is actually chlavard, the ancestor to Lord. We went over that earlier, actually. Chlaf is loaves, right? So the loaf keeper, pretty much, is chlavard. Actually, ward, this is a contraction. Chlafard is chlaf ward, ward, as in guardian type thing. Anyways, so drichten is not a super common word to see here. But I think it's one that you can pretty quickly get an idea for. It just means Lord, right? In many cases, it's going to be capitalized like this anyhow. So Dreichten and variants, there's plenty of modern spellings I've seen before, but they'll still mean Lord. We do have descendants of it, right? Maybe you'll see it in an occasional like fantasy novel or something. But it does actually come from Proto-Germanic Druchtinas, which itself means leader or lord, but this comes from Druchtis, which is a band of retainers or a troop. So this seems to touch on this idea of Germanic comitatus, as the Romans would describe it. So I just think that's interesting, again, especially what you can get from just one word. Don't really think too much about it, obviously. This is more of the philology side of things. But maybe in the Helion it'd be more fitting, right? But and maybe some Anglo-Saxons had this idea. It's this idea of leader of troops. Yeah, right. It'd be better if it didn't say his disciples, though. It said like his warriors. Anyways, no, interesting. That hier Sheldon Laran and Tachan Alm Theodum. So this, I have a couple things. Let's go over here real quick. We have our meme down here, but that they should instruct and teach all peoples. Okay, that's what it means. So Laran, to teach, actually has modern descendants, which is lear and learn. This is, well, there is another much common verb, learn, which means to gain knowledge, actually. This one, well, that comes from Old English, lernian, so don't get confused. Laran, lernian, right? Which, again, is to learn or study. So learn in modern English, in this sense, again, not, I would say, is generally classified as dialectal or informal, but learn can mean teach. So that's why, like, when people say that's incorrect, a lot of these things actually like incorrect. It doesn't come up in here, but say something like askion, you'll see people say, oh, you can't say it asks you a question, or whatever. But in reality, askion in Old English means ask, right? That's where we get the word ask. To ask is actually often still axion. So we've been having the ask you a question thing going on for quite a long time. So I just thought that was interesting, right? That he's gonna teach and he's going to teach. That's pretty much what this says. But this emphatic sense is important. And also, I think in using the vocabulary here, Old English is very good with that, using this vocabulary, especially with several meanings. Right? We had the tribulations and hardships one earlier, which pretty much you could translate as the same thing if you really wanted to, as you know, as tribulations or whatever. So it's poetic in that sense, right? But it's interesting. So, anyways, but also I just want to look at real quick theodem, which is the plural theod, which means people, nation, language, depending on context normally. And modern English actually has the dialectal word theed. Can't say I've ever read it anywhere or heard anyone say it. Maybe I have. I'm not sure. I can't remember it, at least off the top of my head. But this actually last word is related to the words Dutch and Deutsch, and I think even Tua in Irish. So, anyways, yeah. So often you'll see in like you're studying in like an anthropological sense, you'll have people who they have their name from some other tribe or whatever. Like in modern English, we'll have a name for these people, but in reality, they call themselves something different. And often what they call themselves are just people, and you'll find the same here, which is not surprising, I guess. So, anyways, then we have Wittigan and Witka. So Witka is the nominative singular here. This means wise man, seer, prophet, sage. Okay. You can actually see it with wits as to know. Anyways, but or witan yemot, right? The king's council in a sense, if you want to say, is king's wise men meeting people. So, but in the preface, Isaiah and Ezekiel are labeled as this, right? By Ælfric. There's actually a modern English cognate because this, but it's funny. Okay, it doesn't actually come from this. There is no descendant in English from Witka, but we have wiseacre. This comes through Middle Dutch from Old High German, actually. But this one actually generally has the meaning of one feigning knowledge, not actually being a sage. But in an older sense, it does denote a wise man. Okay, we also have unjust wise, right? Unrecht wisan, okay? Unrighteous is a good way to translate this. Righteousness often has this sense of justice, right? Like right kind of still does. That's not right, you know what I mean? Which is not just, right? But who says that? Anyways, we're native English speakers, we don't say that. So I just thought it was interesting to point out, though, that then with now having just or justice or whatever coming from the old French, that we now have this idea of we have two different meanings, right? When I say that's unrighteous, I wouldn't use that in the court, like a court of law, for example, right? So, anyways, we also have Bima. We're getting near the end here, by the way, but Bima, Bima. I can't remember. I think the BYME one is the one Ælfric spells, but this is actually a wooden instrument, especially a horn or trumpet. I meant to put a picture here. I guess I didn't. Modern cognates include English beam, which I think is more of a historical term these days, and it means exactly the same as this Old English saying, but again, generally in a historical sense. But we also have beam, B-E-A-M, and there's also German Baum. So they're all related. You can kind of see it, I guess, if wooden instrument, beam, right, which could mean tree in a certain sense, but not really in modern English. And Baum is the German word for tree. So, anyways, Unreon is to uncover. It's literally unrie. Just heads up on that one. These last slides I don't have a lot of information on, but just things that I think are interesting. So Jernolicha, with Thorpe and Lewis actually translate this as carefully. This is the source for our word yearn, though, so it's literally yearnly. I translated it as eagerly. I think, though, in context, I think carefully, diligently, earnestly is an appropriate translation. And also, this is King Alfred's jewel, but this is part of his astel, his pointer for copying text and stuff like that, which is why I put it there. So when this comes to modern English, bison, I'm not actually sure. Never heard the word spoken, and I haven't really looked at it much, but it's something serving as a warning or example to be avoided, something portentous, which is not what it means in Old English. But you can see how it kind of got there through that drift. But I use it as example. That's what I translated it as. Thorpe says copy. not a bad translation. And Liosa says exemplar, which makes him really fancy. And it's actually a really good translation. I mean, I think it's the same thing pretty much. But so yeah. Anyways, just wanted to point that one out again because that's maybe a word that you might not recognize. Depending on how familiar you are with Old English, you might be able to read through a good chunk of it and be like, "Hey, I recognize this. I just need to look at a couple of these words." Right, and this I think would be one. Decent. And then I think this might be my last slide. I'm not exactly sure. Let's see. But we have the last they, the or whatever you want to say it as. The last they. Once we actually get lest, once the instrumental the is actually dropped at the beginning here, and when Ælfric uses it here, actually he does have this the at the end here. This so lasta, but earlier in Old English you often won't see it. You just see thilas. And this is used in the subjunctive mood. This is kind of a frustrating one, or nice, depending on, I guess, how you want to translate it. So you can translate it as the less that not, so that not, before, or else. There's a lot you can do with this one. I think maybe both Liosa and Thorpe use lest. I don't know, it seemed a little easy, so I didn't put it in most cases. So yeah, just heads up there. But yeah, that's it actually. So I'm not sure how long this is. I actually kept it under an hour, so it looks like, which makes me happy. Now, when we get to the next ones, we'll see how long they last. As of right now, I actually recorded this after the reading went up. So if you have questions on those readings and you want me to get to them, I might sometimes record this before the reading actually goes up. So I might not be able to get to it in this presentation. But in this case, actually, if anyone had commented any questions on that reading, I could have covered it specifically in this. But if I didn't cover, if you have any questions, you can just leave those questions below and I'll try to cover them. But I do appreciate it. Also, I'm testing this out. So again, I'm working on things like pronunciation, where I put the stress. But also, like, I put music in the first reading. I hope it worked. It seemed appropriate. It's the same person who drew the art. So, but then also, just as I keep on going forward, the liturgical year actually would start with the nativity, with Christmas, right? And so I feel bad. I just don't have the time to get to it, right? So I divided it into slides, and I had 24 slides for the preface. Epiphany is 59. Okay, so it is more than double that. I don't know if my notes for, like, say, this lecture if it's going to get shorter over time. I mean, the preface is much smaller than the Epiphany homily itself, so I would expect the Epiphany one to be longer than this one. But we'll see how it goes over time. As I get more familiar with text, you get more familiar with text. Maybe we'll have to cover less in some sense, right? Right. As we now know how to count to halves in Old English, we won't have to cover it again. Really. So, anyways, we'll see what I do after Epiphany. If I really can, I'd like to do another one in January. If not, we'll move on to February. It really just depends on how busy I am, how long it takes me. As of right now, I'm about only a third of the way through translating the Epiphany, but I should get it up on time for the 5th is when it will go out, actually. But 4th, 6th, I guess, too. So anyways, again, have any questions, feel free to drop the questions down in the comments or to reach out to me in whatever way you can. So again, thanks for watching. If you have any feedback as well, then let me know. Yeah, thank you.